this Ramadan.
Welcome back to News and Views. I'm your host, Tahir Maepa. The Middle East remains on edge as tension between Iran, Israel, and United States continue to escalate. Military posturing and diplomatic maneuvering have intensified. We are now joined by Press TV correspondent in South Africa, Hassen Seria, for the latest development. Welcome, Habibi. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, Tahir. Thanks for having me on the program.
Now, Hassan, just tell me, what are the latest developments in this conflict? The latest that you are aware of?
Okay, so of course, what we've seen is since this assault was launched on Iran, an unprovoked assault yet again, while negotiations were still underway between the United States and Iran, indirect talks that were being mediated by Oman. We saw the US and the Zionist regime, Israel, carry out that strikes on Saturday against the Islamic Republic. What the Islamic Republic then did was, of course, as it had repeatedly warned, it began with its assault in a very scaled approach, targeting, as it warned, and all of the American bases within the region, particularly on the side of the Persian Gulf, extending all the way up to Israel. What we saw yesterday was an escalation because of the retreat as such of the American forces from these bases that were now coming under attack, is that the Iranians then went as far as targeting Cyprus as well, because that is where the Americans had begun retreating to. So Cyprus came under fire as well. Overnight, of course, the Iranians have continued to pursue in multiple waves their attacks on, for example, the American Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, where if we look at the satellite imagery that is coming out at this point in time, it shows that there's been considerable damage to that base. In fact, some assessments are that it is so extensive that that base will not be able to be used any longer. We also saw during yesterday the downing of 3 American F-15 jets in Kuwait. Now, there's some speculation about who may be behind the downing of those jets. The official statement that's coming from the Kuwaitis and the Americans is that this was the result of friendly fire, but there are major question marks around that. If it was only one jet, we'd understand that that may have been a case of a friendly fire. But when it becomes 3 jets within one morning, within one region, we start asking certain questions. And of course, I think because we're in the thick of war, we'd have to wait and see a bit of time before we get some clarity on exactly what occurred in that situation. Overnight, we've also seen, of course, that Hezbollah yesterday already entered the battle. It fired an opening salvo. It allowed the day to pass in which the Zionist regime, of course, carried out a number of strikes over the length and breadth of Lebanon as such. What we saw in recent hours is that Hezbollah has now said that it has carried out 2 to 3 more attacks on strategic points within the Zionist regime. And the information coming out at this point from the Zionist entity is that they are planning and preparing for a ground invasion of Lebanon. So they're trying to, I think, use a different approach here in terms of how they'd like to approach this. We've also seen from the Iranian foreign minister making comments in terms of the type of defense strategy that the Iranians are using. He termed it as decentralized mosaic defense. Now, this is a very interesting concept. It is something that the Iranians have worked on for over 2 decades now, and it is now coming into play. And the strategic and important thing about this is that even if, as we saw during the June War of 2025, they are attempts by the Zionist regime to go for the top commanders of the IRGC or the Iranian military, that the country that its forces will continue to be fighting because they're working on this sort of strategy of a decentralized mosaic defense system. So that I think also changes the terms of reference for the war, the Iranian approach, and what we are seeing in the region at this point in time. Just off the military sort of element is, of course, that the Iranians have made good on their threat to also close the Strait of Hormuz, and the estimations are between over 1,000 vessels, according to some estimations, are now stuck at that choke point. And that, of course, as you can imagine, has impacted on global oil prices, global gas prices as well. Yeah, but that is something we will have to see how it plays out as well, because they are, of course, allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran that also will be feeding the brunt of that move by the Islamic Republic and its move in this war.
Brother Hassan, are we looking at contained confrontation, or this is already a regional war?
Look, the threat was always that it would be a regional war. Iran said that if it was attacked, because of what we already saw earlier during the strikes by the Zionist regime, unprovoked strikes, that was already after the Al Aqsa flood battle began in 2023. The attacks, for example, on the Iranian mission in Syria as well. And then, of course, the 2025 war, the developments during January of 2026 as well, with trying to instigate forces within Iran to destabilize the country, that Iran said that this conflict would it would not exercise the type of restraint that it has on previous occasions, that this is a conflict that was going to set the region ablaze. And we are seeing that happening at this point in time. I don't think we're at the point of saying that the conflict as a whole yet has brought in other players. But we've seen from the posture of the Europeans, for example, the French, the British, saying that their resources are available for the Zionist regime. We've heard the double speak from them, the double standards as such from them, condemning Iran for an attack that was actually launched unprovoked by the Americans and the Israelis while the Iranians were sitting at the negotiating table. The French, for example, are sending their only aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean. We've seen the British open up their bases in the region, for example, in Cyprus, for use from the American side as well. The Chinese have been clear in saying they support Iran's right to defend itself. We saw a warning yesterday from Dmitry Medvedev, the one of the senior officials in the Russian administration, saying that the US here has miscalculated, and that depending on how the US continues to behave within this current context, that we are potentially standing at the door of World War III. And I don't think by any stretch that that is an exaggeration, but I don't think we've reached that point yet. And we can understand this largely based on how the Iranians have, for example, conducted their military activity at this point in time in successive waves with a gradual escalation, firstly targeting the bases in a particular way, then targeting the Strait of Hormuz and closing the Strait of Hormuz, also not sinking any ships there that did try to breach that embargo on the strait, but actually targeting them in such a way that they would not be able to continue with the carrying out of their movement through the strait. So we've seen that, but we've seen overnight as well that again there's been an escalation. And I think this is particularly the message that if the Americans and the Israelis who struck this match, who set up this current situation that we are seeing, despite all of the reading, despite all of the warnings, despite all of the information and intelligence that was available, that if they decide to continue with this, that Iran will exercise its right to defend itself fully and completely with all of the capabilities and resources that it has.
Thank you very much. Maybe in terms of your closing shot, what could this mean for oil prices and global markets? Could this trigger wider Middle Eastern instability?
But I think the information already. I think there's two aspects to your question. I'll talk about the instability within the region first. Is that there's this big question about the role of the Persian Gulf countries. I'm talking here about these little kingdoms and emirates such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and so on, that house the American soldiers and bases. Now, we've seen from them comments coming out in which they are saying that they should have a right to defend themselves because their territories have come under attack, according to them. Also, that Donald Trump has said that these countries, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, are waiting to join this conflict on the side of Israel and the United States here. But the question here is, what are those American bases doing in these countries in the first place? When you think of a military base, the issue is for fighting wars. They're not there to garden within the Middle East or
Mm,
West Asia as such. They are there for the purpose. So these countries, by having allowed the Americans, first and foremost, to have set up these bases in their countries, have actually exposed their citizens to come under this attack. And Iran has
mm,
been very clear that Iran is targeting these American installations within the region. What has happened is, because of the American retreat, because the Americans couldn't even defend themselves within these bases, they have
mm,
put up their soldiers in hotels in these countries. So the simple solution here is for these vassal states essentially to tell
mm,
the Americans, you are not defending yourselves, you're not defending us as such. And we've seen this from Saudi officials as well, saying that the Americans have been largely focused on defending the Zionist regime, Israel, here, while leaving the Arab countries open to attack, that they have not, that is not a priority for them. So the simple reason is to tell the Americans that because of these failures, that they should leave because they serve no purpose other than to put these countries at risk. I think the context here is very critical because all of these countries before the conflict had already said that they had given the Americans indication that they will not allow them to use their territories for
mm,
the launching of attacks or their airspace. And that is a failure that the Arab regimes have failed in. They have not kept to that promise. So it is, an unfair sort of approach to try to play the victim now when you have given your territory over to the aggressor to allow him to attack, but you're saying that the victim here, the one that is being attacked, may not attack. And this is exactly within the doctrine of colonial powers. We see it with the Israelis as well. They
mm.
can attack Palestinians, but Palestinians should have no right to retaliate in any way. So this is exactly the language and the posture that these regimes are using. And I think an important thing that CNN, for example, was reporting was that Saudi Arabia and the UAE had reportedly asked Iran to at least designate an area within the Iranian desert so that they could fire missiles over into that area and at least argue that they have now retaliated. And I think if we think of this in the context of what we've witnessed since 2023, the challenges that the Palestinians have had to fight under a siege that was imposed wholly with the support of these Arab countries as well, that they could not have the ability or the will to even send not missiles or rockets or any advanced military equipment, even bullets over to the Palestinians to assist the Palestinians in their struggle for justice and freedom. But these very same countries are saying, as reported here by CNN, that they're willing to waste missiles by bombing it into an open desert area in Iran in order to at least save some face. The question here is, what dignity do these regimes actually have, and what credence should we give to these claims that they are making?
Ridiculous indeed. We're going to take an ad break, Hassan, and I want us to explore that point exactly a little bit further after the ad break.
Certainly.
More than 800 million people around the world live in deep poverty,
Salam Media, your spiritual companion this Ramadan.
Welcome back to News and Views. I'm your host, Tahir Maepa. I'm joined by Hassan from Press TV. Hassan, you know, the Arab states have entangled themselves into this unholy relationship with the United States and Israel. Now, and it's unsustainable. Obviously, that kind of relationship, it's like you have made a choice that you are pro the West over your own Muslim brothers. But and this obviously is going to be a long-term problem in the region when the influence of the Iranians is rapidly increasing amongst the ordinary Muslims because of they believe, like I believe, that the Iranians are fighting a just war, and it is really the war to humiliate Islam more than Iran. But how can we find a middle ground between these Muslim nations? Because they are forever neighbors. Iran can't move from the Middle East and move somewhere else. Iran will remain there for all eternity. And if the relationship between the Arab or the Gulf states and the Iranians doesn't improve in one way or the other, this situation is going to continue to happen where Muslims are going to kill other Muslims at the behest of the Western countries like the United States and Israel.
I think the important thing to keep in mind here is who are the countries of the region and what right do they have to be there. So we can look at Iran, we can look at countries such as Lebanon, such as Egypt, and then to question which are the forces that are there that don't belong there. So, for example, the United States is based in the west of the world. What are all of these American bases doing within the Islamic world? That is the first question. And I think when we look at the realities that the region, West Asia, has faced, the Muslim world has faced, over the decades, it is primarily because of this presence of the American forces within the region. If we look at all of the conflicts within the region, we look at Iraq, we look at Syria, we look at Lebanon, all of this is because of the American interference within the region. So here the question is what decision needs to be taken as far as the American presence within West Asia. The other one is, of course, a continuing one, and I think there's no question within the Muslim psyche about this, is the artificial presence of the Zionist regime that was implanted into this region by the British, that is supported vehemently by the Americans, as we are seeing here play out. Many saying, even in the US, that the US is here fighting a war on behalf of Israel, that it's no longer America first, it is Israel first. So when we look at this, we see that these are actually the sources of the the distrust that we find between these regional countries. That said, I think we must keep in mind that despite all of that, there has been very good sort of gestures and relations even from countries within the region. We can, I mean, go back a few years and we can see the conflict that happened between the Gulf countries within the GCC, for example, where they're all coordinated against Qatar, where there have been conflicts between Saudi Arabia and the UAE and so on, and even playing out today on the battlefield in other regions where they have proxies fighting, for example, in Yemen, Sudan, and so on. So there will be rivalry between countries. That is to be understood. But despite all of that, the Saudis and the Iranians have signed, for example, a major understanding that was, of course, brokered by the Chinese. And that has survived for a number of years, despite all of these conflicts and all of this interference and so on by the United States. We see Iran and the UAE, for example, despite territorial disputes as well, they cooperate as members of BRICS as well. We look at Kuwait, we look at Oman, we look at even Qatar and the Iranians. There are those relations. So the question here is the age-old colonial sort of approach of divide and conquer. It is to maintain this situation where the countries of the region are engaged in this artificial conflict. The notion as well that the Gulf states have that Iran is a greater threat than Israel is. Now, the question here is, how does that make sense? Has Iran ever attacked any of these countries? What is the role of Israel within the region? Who all has Israel attacked? What are the words of Benjamin Netanyahu, for example, when he says that we know exactly what is happening in all of the Middle East? We've seen this happen in the attacks, for example, on Tunisia when the aid flotilla was taking off from there. We've seen it with Qatar when the Hamas delegation was attacked. We've seen it in the Israeli attacks against the Iranians, against the Syrians, against the Lebanese, even against the Egyptians. So this artificial entity, we can understand from its history and from its actions where it stands and who the actual partners within the region are. But I think to hope that there will be ever a situation where neighboring states don't have any sort of disputes in that, that is perhaps trying to ask for a utopian outlook. The reality is, even if we take it outside of this region, we can look at India and Pakistan, for example. We look at recently Afghanistan and Pakistan. We can look at India and China. There are going to be those disputes and disagreements and so on between countries. This is part of the natural sort of diplomatic engagement and so on. But the greatest source of instability remains the American presence within the region, the American interference in the region, and the continued occupation of the Palestinian lands by the Zionist regime. And I think that is where these Arab countries, I don't say this with any sort of hopes, should be re-looking at their strategy and really understanding what the situation is. Of course, the reality of these Arab states, and this is a good time to read history, is that these are essentially vassal states that were created by the British and French and so on when they left the region. So to expect anything other than that, because they need to be artificially maintained, because they are essentially families that are running these little kingdoms and emirates, as they call themselves. They're not democratic systems or true states in the true sense of the word. That to hope for that, I think at this point in time, is not really something that we are going to see come to fruition.
There's been all sorts of talks, especially with regards to the British. The Prime Minister there has indicated that he's willing to, for instance, to host some of the fleet of the United States and all that. Do you think there may be temptations by some of the European allies of the US joining into this war? And what will that mean in terms of the Iranian allies like China and Russia? Can we see a situation where if they decide to join this war, that Russia and China may come to the aid of Iran? And what does that mean for the global stability in general?
I think we should understand that the Chinese and the Russians have already given Iran aid. The understanding at this point in time is that it's a conflict between the United States and Israel against Iran. A large part of this is because of Iran's role, its critical role, both from a support element in terms of word, but also in action of supporting the Palestinian resistance, that this is why Iran is under attack at this particular point in time. However, within the context of China and Russia, Iran is essentially the frontier. There's a strategic alliance between these countries, um, and the understanding or the strategic sort of approach from the US is that by taking out Iran, it then paves the way and opens the way for the infiltration of Russia, and then, of course, for eventually that battle with China. So I think from that point, to look at this situation, the Chinese and the Russians are already involved here, and the understanding is that apart from the military hardware, there's also a lot of intelligence and so on, and there's coordination between these sides with the Iranians. But at this point in time, in terms of the battle itself, Iran is still sufficiently fine to fight this battle on its own. And we've seen these comments coming from the European side as well, that the French, as I said earlier, is sending the aircraft carrier to the region. We've seen from the British opening up their bases and so on, that the West as a whole always stands together. They stand together when it comes to any of these conflicts. We've seen it in Afghanistan, Iraq, we look at Palestine as well. That the premise is not what is truth, what is just, what is right. It is to maintain the hegemony of the West, the European colonial sort of mindset, and that is essentially what we will see. But if we do reach that point, as you asked, where the British or the French or the Germans or any of the other countries within the region who already incidentally are involved in some way or the other, that if they become actively involved in the conflict, that we are potentially going to see then the expansion of this war. And I think when I spoke about Dmitry Medvedev, the senior Russian official and former president of that country, where he says that we are standing on the brink of World War III, that he's also issuing that sort of warning that the Russians will not sit idly by. I think the Russians and the French have also, the Russians and the Chinese rather, have also learned from, for example, situations such as Syria, where we had this artificial force that was created, drawn in from around the world under the name of so-called Islam, that fomented this unrest within that country, eventually saw the collapse of the government of Syria, and is now fully supporting and fulfilling the role of being a protector for the United States and for Israel. So the Russians and the Chinese have learned from this. They've learned, for example, from what has happened in Venezuela as well, and they've realized that they can no longer sit back. Of course, we'll see in the moment to what degree the Russians and the Chinese actually get involved. But we can already see in terms of the comments that are coming from China, it is not the normal standard neutral sort of statements that it is issuing, where we call on all sides to exercise restraint. China is saying very clearly, we support Iran's right to defend its sovereignty. This is a very clear statement of support that is coming from the Chinese, and I think that backed up by the military support that the in terms of the hardware that the Chinese are offering, the intelligence and so on, the use of its satellite networks and so on, that all speaks to a greater involvement that the Chinese and the Russians are involved in. But the unfortunate thing about this situation, with the Chinese and the Russians standing ready to defend themselves, and the British and the French that have been involved in colonialism and so many wars over the decades, illegal wars, the massacre of people, people that are brown as such, essentially, the continuation of this colonial project, that that puts us on the brink of World War III. We're not at that point, at this point yet, but of course, depending on how these countries carry themselves, that is certainly a reality that we may be looking at some point in the future.
Thank you very much for that insight, Brother Hassan. We really appreciate your input here on Salam Media. As we conclude today's edition of News and Views, we are reminded that in a world filled with tension, uncertainty, and shifting political landscape, reflection remains powerful. From South African foreign policy debate to youth movement shaping Kenya's future to humanitarian realities in places like Malawi and Afghanistan and the untold developments in the Middle East, today's conversation reminds us that the global events are never distant. They shape economies, influence diplomacy, and affect ordinary people. In this blessed month of Ramadan, may we approach this issue with wisdom, compassion, and renewed commitment to justice. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.